Recording has started.
Okay, so welcome everybody and thanks for joining. So we've got, as you know, we've got a fair few people on Skype, we've got a few people in the room here as well. So we're going to spend about the next hour and 20 minutes, Laura and I, taking you through the responsible feedback session. I've met everybody on Skype and in the room. I'm Sam, I'm the Chief Operating Officer.
And I am Laura, I'm one of the HR officers here.
And just to give a bit of context of where this training and this workshop come from, we started talking about this feedback and developing feedback within our culture quite a lot back in March at the away days that we had at Warwick. But it is now become really a strong expectation that we have from all employees to really embrace and get to grips with and understand and work through feedback. And of course, it's also embedded deeply within the competencies of the organisation. When we look at our appraisals, reflectiveness, and is there and has a strong focus on feedback. It's also a big part of the freedom and responsibility paper that everyone will have, I know everyone will have, has been sent, has seen, has read through, has engaged within their teams. So it's one of the key 7 areas within that paper. And what it says about feedback in the paper is that feedback is the oxygen of freedom and responsibility. Without it, we stop setting expectations and communicating disappointments. And it goes on to talk about that, and we'll go into that a little bit more as this session goes on. But just to move on to what we are going to cover today. So we're going to talk about what happens, what the consequences of not giving good feedback consistently are. We're going to share some models that we have found useful and that others seem to find useful in terms of both giving and receiving feedback. We're going to talk a bit about Radical Candor, which is a book by Kim Scott, a former executive at both Google and Apple University, which a number of different people have been reading, and in fact forms a bit of the freedom and responsibility paper now. So it doesn't matter if you haven't come across that and you haven't read any of it. We'll explain it, and even for those that have read it, it won't be too. We won't be repeating too much. We'll be going into a bit more depth. Then we're going to also look at the importance of being open to receiving feedback and some of the key things there. And we'll also talk about how we balance praise and criticism. So those are the things that we're going to cover. Before we go any further, what would be great is just to hear from each person, because there are some people newer to the organisation than others, just to hear your name, your job title, and just your level, if you can give a reflection on your level of confidence about giving feedback to others at work. So it doesn't need to be long, just a bit of an insight into how you feel about that. So if we start on the phones, Ross, could we start with you, please?
Yes, so my name's Ross Duncan. I'm a practice tutor from the North East. In terms of confidence and giving feedback, this has probably been the only organisation where it's been actively sought after. So it's probably only since I've been with Frontline, which was last September, that actually it's been more explicitly sought after. So it's probably a learning curve really for me in terms of how I give feedback and receive feedback really. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Becky?
Hi, I'm Becky Brew. I'm a principal practice tutor for the Midlands. Sorry, could I just clarify? You're asking how I give and receive feedback, or my experiences of it?
Yeah, your level of comfort, confidence in it.
Okay, well, I give feedback a lot in my role, and I have done for many years, I suppose, since I've moved into management in local authorities and within our role as practice tutors. I like to receive feedback from others. But I'm not always that good at giving feedback within Frontline, I don't think.
Okay, thanks, Becky. And Lisa?
So Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. So yeah, I'm Lisa. I'm the delivery director at Frontline. I am reasonably confident in giving feedback. I think that confidence in giving feedback needs to be kind of in line with an organisational ethos around caring and knowing your team. Otherwise, it just comes across as a little bit blunt. And I think that's something for us all to kind of grapple with at Frontline. You know, whether there's that secure base for operating in giving direct feedback.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. And Claire?
Hi, I'm Claire Lehman, the Regional Coordinator in the North East, and I've been with Frontline since last September as well, same day as Ross. This is the first organisation that I've been asked to provide feedback to colleagues in a sort of structured way, but I find that the questions are a helpful prompt, and knowing that feedback is being requested and given for everybody at the same time of year means that it doesn't feel so much like, I don't want to use the word attack or something unhelpful, but yeah, as long as it's given in the tone that it's meant. I think if feedback comes from somebody that you work closely with, then I definitely feel confident delivering that.
Great, thank you. Alan, come to you.
Yeah, hi. I'm Alan Brownrigg, Head of Region for the North East. I guess similar to what lots of people have said so far, I feel feedback's a feature of what I do and experienced in giving and seeking and receiving feedback. I think for me, one of the challenges is to get the balance right between reminding people of the good news stories, the successes they have, alongside opportunities to help people think where things could be developed and changed, but also when giving and receiving feedback to have conversations that are open and respectful in that process is really important.
Thank you. So I'll come to, is that everybody on the phone? I've not missed anyone. No. So I'm Laura, I'm the HR officer, and I think in terms of giving feedback, similar to a lot of people on the phone, this is the first organisation that I've ever kind of been requested it genuinely, and I'm definitely a lot more confident than I have been, particularly since doing these workshops, but kind of also balancing between being really forthcoming with praise, I think is an area where I kind of need to grow a little bit.
And as I said, I'm Sam, the Chief Operating Officer. I've worked at organisations that have really put a premium on feedback, but only Frontline, I think, where we've an organisation where we've actually tried to put make it quite cultural, part of the way we operate, and really thought about how to achieve that. I found myself over the last 6 months becoming more confident in giving feedback. Where I struggle is giving praise in the moment. So that's where I struggle most, and that's an area that I'm working on.
I'm Anna, I'm First Line Programme Officer. I've worked for an organisation where, when I think about it now, I was given feedback in a kind of conversational way, but it was a small organisation, so it's easier to do that because everyone does know each other personally. So this is the first time I've worked for kind of an organisation, like Claire mentioned, that was where feedback is structured. And at first I think I was a little bit uncomfortable with that. Because I saw it maybe as an opportunity to criticise rather than an opportunity to help you kind of work out what you're good at. But then at the First Line Residential last time, there was a big thing about radical candour and we talked to First Line leaders, and actually that's where it's kind of clicked for me, and the different types of feedback, and yeah, that's been helpful. I have a different attitude to it now.
I'm Ellie, I'm Partnerships Manager in the External Relations team. Similar to what everyone else said, this is the first organisation where I've been actively asked to give feedback to my
kind of peers and colleagues. And as a manager, I'm quite used to giving feedback to my team, but not necessarily. I think the challenge for me is like colleagues outside my team or people who I'm reporting into. I've found that a little bit more challenging, and I'm getting used to it now.
Hi, I'm Trish. I'm the HR officer here. I've been with Frontline for a month. So in my previous organisation, my team was quite good at giving feedback, but it was always through like my manager, and I always had an issue with people not coming to me directly. So I think it's great to hear that there's more of an open culture, because I appreciate feedback directly from the person rather than feeding it to the manager and the manager kind of telling you. So.
I'm Talia. I'm the HR assistant. I've been here, I think, 2 months now. I think being in a more junior role, you're probably more used to receiving feedback than you are to giving it. And then similarly as everyone else in my last organisation, I would go like, unless like something went wrong, you'd go like a year without having any feedback or not hearing anything about whether it's praise or where to improve.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So, I just want to touch for a little while on the cost. We'll move on the slide. Yeah, the cost of avoiding giving feedback. So, what we might lose, what we might miss out on if we're not, if we don't embrace this, and if we're not having a culture where feedback's consistent and common. What do people have a sense of? I might disappear for a moment for anyone on Skype, but I'm just going next to the screen, and I'm going to just write down some ideas that people are coming up with. So if we start, anyone in the room, or on Skype, if you've got an idea, just to call it out. So what's the cost, do you think, of avoiding giving feedback?
People don't know where they stand. They don't know if they're doing a good job or a bad job. They don't know. They just don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know where they stand. And what's like the negative outcome of that? Not knowing where you stand.
They may feel that their work isn't valued, so they might leave, or they might feel like they've put a lot of effort into something and it's not been recognised. So again, they might leave.
Yeah.
You don't give them the opportunity to improve.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can affect your own work if they're not helping you like they should do, or providing support, or whatever they should be doing. It affects your own outcomes.
So it affects your it affects the quality of your outcomes.
Work, yeah.
And what about anything else on that one?
I think you either risk like things being done improperly another time, or things not being done as well as they should have done because you've not acknowledged how well they were done.
So you can repeat mistakes.
Yeah, or not repeat great things you've done because people don't realise how good it was.
Yeah, I think that one's really key, because we focused a bit there, which is absolutely true, on like the negative implications. Primarily on like the detrimental side of things, but maybe even the most detrimental might be that if we don't give feedback, people don't know where they stand, and therefore the great things that they do, they don't know what's great about it, and then we won't know how to repeat that or to focus on that even more if it is great. Okay. Anyone on Skype, either on that point or anything else, about what the risks are or what the costs are of avoiding giving good feedback?
I think that if you avoid giving feedback, great feedback and feedback for improvement, it impacts on people's morale. Because there's nothing forthcoming, and it impacts on team relationships. Things get avoided. Cracks get papered over, but I think it has a huge impact on morale if people aren't orientated in terms of how they are fitting or working or doing great work within an organisation. So yeah.
Yeah, completely agree. On morale, it's sort of another way of looking at it is it doesn't. As someone's not getting feedback, then it almost is a reflection of you not or maybe even not caring. So if it's a demonstration of caring, whether it's constructive or praise. Feedback is a demonstration that you care enough to tell someone about it. So it demonstrates a level of interest, and if without it, it can have quite a big impact on morale and the way people are feeling, as Lisa said, on relationships, or things not being addressed. And I suppose the other thing with things not being addressed is it can lead to to grievances, to a kind of a digging in. So it's when things aren't addressed, they can start to become misinterpreted, or they can become bigger than they originally were, or you can get into this cycle. And we'll come on to a model which looks at this, but it's often where grievances come from because feedback hasn't been provided. Any other costs on Skype? Anyone else have any ideas about what the cost is of avoiding feedback?
I would tie in a little bit with what Lisa said in terms of, I think for me it would lead to a sense of frustration. So, for example, if you've done something that you feel is positive, but you don't get any, constructive or positive feedback, then you might feel resentful as to why should you want to work in that way if you don't get the feedback that is positive. And I suppose the flip side of that is if you're doing something that is not constructive to the organisation, and that is then frustrating other people. If they don't give you that feedback, then you're just going to replicate that behaviour, which will then lead to more frustration. So it can work on both sides.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to mirror that point in the sense that if you're not getting any feedback, it can kind of lead to like a ripple effect of you kind of feeling a bit reluctant to be giving feedback. Not everyone's that comfortable with it, and we're kind of like embedding that into the culture. But if you don't feel like you're really receiving it, and then you're putting yourself out there having to have that conversation with someone else, it can be quite difficult. We kind of want it to be like a level playing field.
I think as well you can miss the opportunity to help colleagues to think about new ways of doing things that they already do.
Yeah. Okay, so we're covering kind of like if we don't, from your point, Laura, if we don't role model, then we're not going to really make it cultural. And your point, Claire, that we need contribution from others to develop our ideas, and that's feedback plays a big role in that. Okay, well I think though we've covered a fair amount there, so we'll leave that there.
So the next couple of slides are around some models of the basis of good feedback, and also kind of how you might want to structure giving feedback, and then kind of moving on specifically to radical candor. So I don't know if some people might be familiar with this model. I call it the I'm okay, you're okay model. It comes from transactional analysis, so some people might be a bit more familiar with that. Where we kind of want people to be is in the green box of I'm okay, you're okay. And that's kind of where, when you're receiving feedback, you're quite comfortable and you're secure in your role or in your position, and you are quite content with somebody kind of either criticising or giving you praise to help you develop, because you're okay and you know that the person that is giving you the feedback is okay and in doing it for the right reasons. What you can find yourself in is I'm not okay, you're okay situation. And I think this one is quite a difficult one to be in, but also something like really to think about how you might structure your feedback if you were in this position. And this box on the top left-hand quadrant is kind of an example they used in a previous workshop that we've run, is around kind of if you feel like you've kind of been letting people down a little bit, you might feel more reluctant to kind of pull people up on things when they're kind of not doing what they should be. So someone in the last session said felt that she kind of wasn't doing what she should have been doing, so it was quite difficult for her to then pull up her team on it. And things being handed in late, it has really serious consequences. It makes us look unprofessional. But then I haven't really been doing what I was meant to do. I haven't passed that on time. I won't say anything. I'm sure they'll kind of it will work itself out. And you kind of don't really want to be in that position of kind of not being able to kind of feel like you can say something because you don't feel okay in yourself. What you could also be in, if you are in the bottom right hand corner, and this is kind of like a really negative place to be, is I'm okay, you're not okay. And that kind of presents itself in quite a like an angry way. It kind of feel like you've built up this threshold of you're always late, your work isn't good, and not kind of, but it's not my problem, it's yours, and I want you to fix it. And that's not coming from a place of trying to help that person. You've kind of built up this story in your head about them. So therefore, the way that you're giving that feedback might not be well received. And then the place where we kind of don't really want anyone to be is this kind of like hopeless situation in the left-hand side of I'm not okay, you're not okay. So nobody is kind of giving anyone feedback because they don't feel comfortable in that situation. Do any of those boxes or kind of the examples I've given kind of resonate with you, or kind of think about a time that you've been in one of those situations where you've either not given feedback because you're sitting in one of those boxes, or you do feel comfortable because you know the person giving it to you is like doing it for the right reasons? On the phone?
I think like this model is kind of probably more about like perception, because you might perceive that the other person's okay with you giving feedback and I'm okay. You may feel like you've sat in that green box, but the other person is not okay. So I don't know how you would address that.
This is true. It's so true. I think this is where I find this model useful is when I pause, because it's probably the hardest thing to see when you're in it. And it's almost really useful when you talk to someone, they can tell you that you might be in one of these positions, but it's hard to see it yourself. So I've been in this position where I'm okay, you're not okay. I can remember times where I've been in there, and so it's something that you often get in this situation where you might be speaking to your line manager. I found myself in a situation where I'm speaking to my line manager about some feedback about somebody else, and it's that time when my line manager has said to me in the past, look, it's fine for you to mention this, but you need to tell the person this, and often that is because you're in a position where you've made an assumption about what the other person's thinking or feeling, and that is that assumption, the frustration that's built into an assumption, that's probably the most dangerous. And what I find is when I can feel when I'm doing that, and that's when I feel I urgently need to speak to the person. And when I speak to the person, I need to come at it from an open mind, so not to reflect what I've built it up into, which is that they're not okay and I'm right and they're wrong, but more from an openness to thinking, actually, let's hear what the things I've assumed might actually be completely wrong. And that's how kind of identifying where you are in these boxes can be useful, but it takes some practice.
I think also from one of the things that's really important about this model, and it kind of follows through to all the other ones, is this theme of a lot of this will be based on your relationship that you have with that person, and the red boxes wherever you're sitting shouldn't necessarily be a barrier to you giving the feedback, but something for you to think about in relation to that relationship you have with the individual, because that will kind of tell where you are sitting, and you would be able to kind of you'll know more depending on that relationship. So
I also think it's important to that's how you've delivered it there. It doesn't really take into consideration the power that exists between people and status. And I was interested in Sam's idea about, and sort of who you are, what you bring to the table, your own lived experiences. I don't think, as it's been delivered there, it really takes into consideration the power imbalance within the organisation and how you sort of navigate your way around that when you're looking at whether I'm okay and you're not okay.
I think that this one's more like thinking about, like, you have to take into consideration the relationships that you have, and I think the next model that we go into is kind of one that is kind of a little bit better. So
I'm not criticising the model. I'm just saying that within that sort of frame of reference, you have to acknowledge power imbalance and the structures within the organisation of power, and what power, and there's positive power as well. So I'm not just saying power is from a negative connotation, but you have to you can acknowledge that in that model.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. I'm just saying it needs to be acknowledged and recognised.
Really.
That's my view anyway.
Anything else? Anyone on the phone? Cool. Okay, I'll go on to the next model of giving feedback. So this is my favourite one of them all, just because I think it's one that it's actually used for couples therapy, but I think it's really great because it's really relatable to the work context, because you can often see, as soon as I start explaining it, kind of how you can end up kind of falling down this the tower, as we'll call it. So the top one is actually attraction, but obviously we've taken that out for the work context. So starting with appreciation, if you think about a time where you first started working with someone and you start to notice all the really great things about them, or a really great piece of work they've done, and you really, really appreciate that about them. So that kind of I guess sets a bit of a precedence, and that's what you've become familiar with, and that's what you're used to in that kind of working relationship. So that's kind of what you then kind of expect of that person. So once you kind of got familiar, and this sets the expectation of your working relationship. And then what happens is that person disappoints you. A piece of work isn't as good, or they've done something that you don't think has been particularly helpful, and they fall down from expectations and disappointment. And kind of where we want to be is kind of always being in between disappointments and expectations, because we're going to fall down at some point. It's not to say that everyone's going to be perfect all the time, but the way that we anticipate that everybody kind of will kind of be in that loop around expectations and disappointments is through this loop of feedback. Because if they don't know that they've disappointed you, then what you find yourself is this kind of sets like grievances, and you start to notice these things, and they really start to bother you. But obviously that person in the situation doesn't necessarily know that they feel like you're disappointed with them, or that they're not doing a good piece of work because nothing's been said. And that kind of builds up a threshold. And I think like a good example of this is if you think about somebody kind of who's like late all the time. Instead of you kind of, you haven't flagged it, so instead you've kind of constantly trying to find ways to prove that you're right, and you'll just be picking up every single little thing that they do that to prove that you're right, that person is always late. You're doing what you need to be doing. So then you kind of end up in this really unhealthy place of kind of you just constantly building up this narrative about this person, because no conversation has happened around it in between expectations and disappointments, and they've just fallen further and further down this loop. And I think it's quite easy to see how you can kind of like drop down, but also quite easy to, like, the further down you get, the harder it is to kind of move back up, which is why that if we're kind of in this constant culture loop of giving feedback, going from disappointments to expectations, then it's kind of a lot easier to move again further and further back up to appreciation. Does that kind of does that make sense? Kind of how, or like think about when you might have seen that kind of happen in your the work context.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, but I just think with the disappointment, that person's gonna have to care that they've disappointed you, because in a work context, you might be given something to do, and you might not do it well, but you might not. I don't care whether you tell me that it's late. I don't care that I'm late. You're gonna, as the individual, or you're gonna have to, or I don't know what relationship, other person's gonna have to have some consciousness, like, and care that, or else I think the model might break down if the person themselves don't care that they're a disappointment, because some people come to work, do their job, and they don't really care.
I suppose I suppose in that sense, disappointments might be connected to competencies or something, because disappointment's quite a personal thing, isn't it? Like one person's ideas around being disappointed might be different from another's on a personal level. But I suppose are you seeing it within a professional context, Laura?
Yeah, so I guess like the disappointment, say for example, you've done a report and there was a load of things missing from it, that's kind of where the disappointment has come from. And instead of flagging that and kind of saying this was my expectations of what was supposed to be in the report, you've just kind of fixed it yourself and kind of submitted it so that it's done. And then you're kind of, in your head, you've still got that at the back of your mind, but no, you've not raise that with the person, so then you kind of then are moving further down in terms of looking for those kind of mistakes, and we kind of don't want to be in that position of where we're looking for things to kind of prove that we're right about that narrative that you've made up.
And I suppose, Trish, on your point, maybe in that kind of situation it's been sort of skipped between familiarity and disappointments, or maybe the first stages haven't been, so the expectations aren't set yet. So if somebody doesn't care, it's because they don't realise it's an expectation, or they do realise it's an expectation and they're not fulfilling that expectation. But that's when how it can occur. But I suppose also the point about being in that feedback loop between expectations and disappointments is you get to have the chance to have the conversation. So you might get to understand that someone doesn't care, and then you have the opportunity to understand why they might not care, or whether it's not that they don't care, but there's something else going on. It gives you that opportunity to start getting into it before it turns into actually they're just wrong, or even worse, even worse, something getting even more stuck that you really can't get back from, because it starts to become self-fulfilling, and then it becomes I'm right and they're just so wrong. So it's that the opportunity that expressing these disappointments in whatever way and level they are, the information it gives you and the expectations it allows you to then set between you.
And I suppose that's probably linked with clarity of expectations, isn't it? So in order to have a successful feedback loop like that, you need to make sure that you have this clarity around expectations, so that everybody understands if somebody's, I'm not sure about the word disappointed, but everybody understands if somebody is disappointed. otherwise you don't really know what the expectations are in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Like if the clarity around expectations is really, really good, it's far less likely that you'll have lots of you'll have lots of this occurring. It might just be once in a while, as opposed to normally if there's lots of disappointments, it's normally not necessarily to do with, it's certainly almost always as much about lack of setting expectations than it is about work not being done, for example.
I would just also maybe say on the topic of like positive feedback as well, if the failure to provide positive feedback at the expectations level could then also end up resulting in disappointments as well. So rather than not necessarily pointing out what someone's done wrong, but if you don't point out what someone's done well, that could lead to their own disappointments and then kind of them going down the negative.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts, points, questions on this model?
The thing with having the feedback loop with bad disappointment would suggest that once you've given the feedback, you're not disappointed anymore.
Yeah, so I think.
Would you not say that sometimes people are just disappointed and then given the feedback, they're still going to be disappointed?
I think the point is kind of around, once you've given the feedback, they have the opportunity to kind of improve or change the behaviour around, or do whatever task it is that needed to be done differently, and they have the opportunity to kind of get better. Then you'll back out what you both understand is the expectations of like kind of that particular task or your role or whatever. So you might personally still be disappointed, but you then have the opportunity to kind of get back up to the appreciation and familiarity, because you're aware of kind of what needs to change.
Yeah, there must be times when people are just disappointed if they've done one thing wrong rather than a behaviour, that people just like find it hard to move on.
So
say a bit more, Tanya. What do you think? Say that a bit. So just say that a bit more.
Just like someone, I don't know, or like someone does something and you and it's affected whatever,
Yeah.
a piece of work or something,
Yeah.
just then giving feedback sometimes wouldn't get rid of that disappointment.
Your own disappointment of,
Yeah.
of it not being done
Yeah.
for you or the person. Yeah.
Or either way around, whether you
Yeah.
receive feedback and that
Yeah.
person's still disappointed,
Sure.
or whether you're giving the
Yeah.
feedback to someone else.
I guess it like Laura said, it sort of provides the opportunity.
Yeah.
You're right, like it won't always work, but it at least gives that opportunity. Like a really simple one to articulate this. It's not always best to use the most simple, but it is quite easy to articulate. It might be someone's late to work, and the line manager, let's say, and I know this is quite a binary line manager direct report, but it's an easy one to explain. So the line manager is disappointed. They think, that's a bit annoying. They shouldn't have not told me that they're going to be late. I think they should have at least done that. It's not, that's bad. If it's not fed back, then there's no chance to take that any further. So, for example, it could be that the person has something outside of work, caring responsibilities, which means that getting into work at that time is particularly problematic. And actually, once that conversation that maybe is open, there's an opportunity then to reset expectations, to say, well, look, okay, it's okay with both of us that actually you're going to be late sometimes, and that isn't going to result in a disappointment in the future. It might be acknowledged, but it won't be a disappointment, and in fact it might stop being acknowledged because it's just something that's been discussed, and it allows, it might allow some understanding. But you're absolutely right. There's a risk. It doesn't always. It does depend. It doesn't always get there.
Sorry, I just was going to just add that kind of pictorial diagram I think is really useful for people to see, because my experience of being part of a team, of leading a team, is that this can escalate really quickly. So for me, this just really resonated in terms of relationships and working with people, how those processes start and how they can ultimately end up. And I think that, if we think about our kind of practice models or our alignment with systemic thinking, that position of being able to occupy a position of curiosity, say about the person who's always late, rather than kind of jumping quickly to, how it, because a lot of the disappointment is often related to how it makes you feel, or that someone is not sort of, doing as you would want within a team. And it's really easy to escalate up that scale, in my experience. As a team member and as a manager, I've seen lots of circumstances where this is what's being acted out, and it creates that sort of negative feedback loop all the time. So yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. So this one isn't around kind of the intent of giving, the purpose of giving feedback, but kind of a really, I guess, basic structure for people that don't necessarily feel that confident with giving feedback and might want to kind of put some structure around it. This is one of the models that could kind of help just add a framework to how you might go into that conversation. And I'll just kind of go through the list. So the intent really kind of sets the tone for the conversation. If you go into that conversation that I'm giving you this feedback because, and then they understand that, it's either because you think you've done an absolutely fantastic job and you want to do more of it, or I think that you have amazing potential, but this kind of thing needs to change. It really sets the tone for the conversation, and then kind of goes into what you want to share. So then you've got the behaviours, and this point is really, really important, not to kind of focus on behavioural traits, but what you've actually seen. It's really, really unhelpful at this point in time to start commenting on things other people have told you. So-and-so has said that you've done this and you've done that. You're giving them the feedback on what you think and what you have observed, whether it's report hasn't been done on time. The impact is particularly important, and the reason I think that is because that can't be taken away from you. Whether there was someone didn't speak to you in the best manner in a team meeting in front of people, the impact that has on you, whether it was their intention or not, can't be taken away, and that's really personal to you, and you kind of want them to understand that impact that it's had. Obviously, be really curious as to what may have caused that behaviour, and kind of whether there was anything else going on, and kind of, you know, also be curious to kind of what how they feel about that feedback. And then finally, kind of having some kind of closing commitment, or kind of what you expect to see going forward, or how you might do that together. So this could be kind of a how do you think that we can make this work going forward? So it doesn't necessarily have to be directive, but kind of ensuring that they understand the feedback that you're giving them, because sometimes it doesn't have to be done straight away. You might want to process that and come back to it, and kind of then kind of have that commitment. I have a recent example of this, which with Sam, where we were having a conversation at the end of an interview, and I basically I went to the conversation and I said, I want to give you this feedback because I think it's really, really important, as it's potentially the first relationship that you're going to have with that person at Frontline, and I noticed that I felt like you looked quite bored in that interview, and the reason I felt like that was because you were kind of flicking through the CV, and I kind of didn't feel like you were giving them their full attention. And the impact that can have is it can kind of make us look quite unprofessional as an organisation, and I feel like it's really important to share that information with you. And then around the curious and commitment, we kind of had a discussion, and Sam kind of wanted to understand if there was anything else that he could have done differently in that situation. And then the commitment actually came from Sam, just kind of saying to me that I wasn't necessarily aware that that's how it would have come across. And now that I am, it's going to be something I'm really conscious of in interviews going forward. And that is kind of like a clear way to kind of like follow that structure that Sam's found quite beneficial.
Yeah, I found like being on the receiving end of that, I found like using these different areas was particularly good. So I always think, I don't know, I think the impact can be so important, and particularly like what Laura was saying about how the impact it had on you. In that situation, it was more like what impact it might have on the organisation. You know, it might give someone a bad experience, which actually, to me, that really got me. That really, you know, personally got me that I could be doing something that's actually giving someone a bad experience and reflecting poorly on the organisation. But it can equally be really powerful when someone might tell me, "You said this," and it kind of made me feel like that. That's equally, that sharing that impact can be so powerful. And I also think that. Agreeing at the end, like a commitment, agreeing to how this is going to be resolved, change in the future. It's made me think every time I'm in an interview now, I can hear Laura mentioning that to me. You know, I didn't think that it was anything. I wasn't aware of it. You know, that's the thing why it was so helpful. I wasn't aware of it, and it was so specific the way that it was delivered that it wasn't something it was something I could only be open to because it was something that had been observed. In the way I was, the behaviours that I was using. So it's given me an opportunity to kind of change that.
Could I just ask something, or just have a view, or just say something, please? Thank you. I'm just wondering if how you've just explained that model, which was like it's a helpful model, but when it's such a personal interpretation of something, does this allow you to have a discussion about whether Laura's interpretation of events was correct? Because you could have an example where somebody offers you feedback and that's about how they've interpreted it, and so this just allows you to have a discussion about that in the curious.
Yeah, exactly, because I think all feedback's subjective, isn't it? You know, all feedback's based on your experience, and I think as long as and we'll get onto it a bit, but you know, it all stands to reason. As long as feedback isn't delivered through emotion, you know, that's why sometimes it can be better the times when it's right to pause and not provide feedback when it's not coming from the right place, and equally if it's not received in the right way. So I suppose I could have been defensive, and that wouldn't have helped anything. But I could have also said, actually, it's another example. Laura and I do give each other a lot of feedback, which is helpful. But another time, Laura gave me some feedback about how I'd made a point when we were talking, and I didn't really understand it. And at first, I didn't agree with the point that Laura was making, and so I was in that moment. I was sort of trying not to be defensive because. But it was about, I didn't really understand the point she was making, and it was absolutely right to be curious about why she feels like that. And it came down much more onto like the impact that I'd had on her, me speaking to her in that way. So there was an opportunity there. I suppose that example which happened in the interview, it was so it was kind of clear cut. You know, it was kind of like I saw it straight away. You know, I saw. Yeah. I didn't feel defensive about it because I think it was the fact that Laura was so specific and was so specific about the behaviour that it was, you know, although I hadn't realised it myself, the penny dropped immediately.
Yeah, because I was just thinking that we have an example of one of our participants who has ADHD, and he went into a meeting, and in order to manage his I don't know if it's a disability or his way of being, he does a lot of fiddling, and he has like tools and things that help him. And when you look in for like at a serious child protection conference meeting or something, he looks as though he's fidgeting all over the place. So I'm just thinking that he would have had that. I don't think that would have landed very well on him if somebody said, "Oh, you're always fidgeting." I'm not saying, but I'm just saying, I suppose that curious space allows him to say, "Actually, I've got this issue that I deal with like this." Yeah. So.
Yeah, because otherwise, if no one said that to him ever, then people might that might turn into like a disappointment and a grievance, and that person's just always fidgeting, and mentioning it might, although it might not be, there is an opportunity there if it's done in the right way to.
And lots of people mention it to him all the while.
I think the curious part definitely goes both ways, because you kind of receiving the feedback, you have the opportunity to kind of, as Sam was saying when I gave him the feedback about something that he'd said to me, he was particularly curious to really understand that better. And then kind of also with me giving the feedback, I know that there may be other things going on, and I kind of want to understand, although you can't take away how it made me feel, there may be other things that kind of impact, how that has like played out. So it kind of, how you receive it and how you give it, the curious part is really, really important.
I suppose that links back into what Lisa was saying. Thank you.
I just think for me, I think in my experiences or how I may have addressed it, I might not skip the steps, but because it starts with intent of the person. I've always had experience of a person asking, like, in that situation, you firstly ask yourself, how do you think that interview went, rather than going straight to, actually, I've got this feedback for you. I don't know if that changes the model, but if you had asked Sam, how do you think that interview went, and he was aware that actually, that's great, and you could have gone, well, that was shown through how you was behaving. So I don't know if maybe some conversations can be started with, how do you think that went first, rather than just going straight with, I've got feedback for you, because that could actually change the whole dynamic of the conversation.
That's a good point.
Warming it up is really important. So, and it depends where the relationship is. So, like, I do something that Josh has given me feedback about, so I will repeat myself on the same point too many times. And now we've got to the point where, first, now Josh will say, let's move on, Sam, and in front of others, which is a cue to me, where if he just did that the first time I had a meeting with him, I would have probably said, that's rude, and I'm not standing for it. But the point is that when he started to notice it, he started to tell me it, and then we started to, the first time he said it, it was far more like, as you would have, said there, Trish, like, how did you think that when you presented in front of those people, how did you think it went? And what, before going into what, but the benefit could be that you get to a point in the relationship where you don't have to do that.
I've done quite a lot of talking, so I thought you might enjoy a very short video. So this is kind of moving on to radical candor, and I'm just going to show you a really short clip, and some of you may have seen this. It was shared a while back, but some of you are new to the organisation, so obviously you won't have. But it's just, this is Kim Scott, who wrote the Radical Candor book, and I just kind of want to show you a clip of some feedback that she was given, and then kind of get your thoughts on it. Technology permitting. On the phone, can you just let me know if you can definitely hear it and kind of see? I'm just going to press play now so that try. If not, I will just tell you the story because I know it.
So Google's founders and CEO about how the business.
Can you hear?
Like any normal situation, I felt a little bit nervous. And so I walked in wondering how I'm going to get these people's attention, and all I had to do was say how many new customers we had added in the last couple of months, and Eric Schmidt, the CEO, almost fell out of his chair. So I felt like the meeting had gone pretty well. In fact, I felt like a genius. So as I'm leaving the meeting, I walk past my boss, kind of expecting a high five or some form of congratulations, and she says to me, "Why don't you walk back to my office with me?" And I think, oh shit, I've done something wrong. I don't know what it is, but I'm about to hear about it. And she says to me, after a little bit of praise, she says, "You said an awful lot. Were you aware of it?" And I sort of breathed a huge sigh of relief, and I kind of made a brush-off gesture, and I said, "Yes, I know, I do that. It's kind of a verbal tick, no big deal, really." And she said, "Well, I know a great speech coach. Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction?" I sort of make that brush-off gesture with my hand again, and I said, "Did you hear about all those customers? I'm busy. I don't have time for a speech coach." And she stops. She looks right at me, and she says, "When you make that gesture with your hand, I can see I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid and insecure." Now she has my full attention.
So, what are your initial thoughts on that piece of feedback that she was given on the phone or in the room?
Personally, was that in the room?
No.
Personally, I don't like it. I understand that she was brushing the manager off. I don't like the fact you tell someone they sound stupid and insecure. I don't think that, for me, that's not my sort of style. Well, I hope it's not. I hope people tell me if it was. And I don't know that fits with radical candor, really. There's too much rudeness and bluntness and personal attack in that for me.
I agree. I think that the language chosen could have been much more positive. For example, you could sound so much more self-assured, you could sound so much more convincing if you took this step rather than choosing negative language.
Lovely example, Claire.
I think if I was the manager, I would have probably asked, "What do you think the impact is of you saying every third word? Do you think that could have had an effect on the presentation in a way?" To see it is an issue for her, because she obviously doesn't think it's an issue, but then you might be able to give that perspective that actually saying every first word as a listener is off-putting or in better language than what she said.
think it's that you're assuming that by giving someone feedback that's blunt, but that's going to make them change in a positive way. But what if you remove her confidence in presenting altogether?
Mm. I don't think you should call anybody stupid either.
Did she call her stupid?
No, she just said you sound stupid.
Well, I would interpret that as that I was stupid.
Yeah. So she said this was actually the turning point in her career, and that she, over her career, had given hundreds of presentations, and her initial response was, well, why has nobody told me? And in that situation, she actually had a very strong relationship with her manager, and she knew where that was coming from. But she kind of left that conversation thinking that she had got so far in her career and kind of nobody had ever mentioned that she says every other word, and she's very, very successful. But that was kind of the turning point, and this is where the model has kind of like stemmed from. It is a very, very blunt approach, and I think if someone I didn't work closely with said that to me, I would be gobsmacked. But I think if someone that I had that strong relationship with said something that really, really stood out to me, then I would receive it quite differently. And I think this comes back to some of the previous models, which is around kind of understanding that relationship.
Can I just clarify? Are you saying that bluntness is something that you would think is okay? I'm just clarifying. I've watched this whole session in the past as well. I think that there's lots of research around you can deliver feedback that doesn't have to be so brutal.
Can I just add into that? I was just going to highlight, I think there's a number of factors here, and I think you've touched on some of them, Laura. One, this is an exceptionally successful and kind of revered businesswoman. So I think that has to be borne in mind, who's built up a very successful career and making lots of money. So I think that there, in terms of power, there's lots of factors that perhaps make her slightly more robust to take that. Not that I think that is in any way acceptable, but I'd also question, because what she doesn't do, she talks about, actually, yes, I wondered why nobody else has said that to me. I can guarantee you that would not have been her first response. She's a human being. Her first response would have been that intake of breath, however quietly you do it, that hurt. She's reflecting on it now and saying it's a turning point, and I imagine maybe she's turned it into a turning point. But I would absolutely question that her first stance was great. Yeah, this is really helpful.
Yeah, because I've received feedback in the past, and I might go back and reflect on it. Well, I do go back and reflect on all the feedback that I receive, but at first it lands really personally on you and it hurts you. So I think that perhaps she's not saying that side of it.
No, I wouldn't recommend going and saying you sound stupid. I think
that's good. I just wanted to clarify that.
No, I wouldn't recommend that to go out with your teams, but I think
that's
it's more
a very nice thing to say to anybody.
Yeah, the impact that it's had, kind of on reflection, and kind of that she has, it's made such a big impact on her career that nobody up until that point had said anything. And I'll kind of go on to the next slide, kind of to explain the model a little bit more, but the idea that giving that feedback to somebody isn't necessarily that you do it in a way where you intend to make them feel like shit, because that won't get you anywhere. But kind of if I just there we go. You have to really, really care about that person, and it's okay to challenge directly, not so directly that you obviously then end up making them feel awful, because then you're kind of moving into what we describe as obnoxious aggression. And there's like a really, really fine balance between giving someone feedback that they're going to use to develop their career and to kind of really improve, and giving them feedback that's really going to that is not coming from a place where you actually care about that person and you're wanting them to develop. And that the kind of the premise, the fine line between the two is generally based around your is your relationship and the context of that conversation. That's kind of an example of it in a what's it called, Silicon Valley, the
Yeah.
big kind of corporate organisation where they kind of used to that kind of context, and the kind of relationship with that person is strong. But you can, if you don't have either of those things, end up in this kind of obnoxious aggression quadrant of the radical candor model, which is kind of similar to the previous one where you don't give feedback. I'm okay, you're not okay in the previous one.
Yeah, I think the risk, like your Lisa and Becky are articulating, is that in the way that comes across is more obnoxiously aggressive rather than being radically candid. I guess the relationship's key, isn't it? Because if you've developed a relationship where you can be as direct as that, then it's a bit different than if the people have just met. So there's all of that context as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about professional relationships here, aren't you, as well? So we work under the code of conduct, don't we? And also, I think that there's a real skill in delivering feedback successfully, and I think that's something that you have to learn, don't you, over time. It's not the most natural thing in the world to do. I think it's part of a skill set that you have to develop as you get more, as you develop.
And I suppose what we're saying is the best way to develop it is to practice it.
Definitely.
So, to give you a little bit more information on radical candor, how familiar, kind of reaching out to the newer people within the organisation, are you with this this model that we've kind of included as part of our feedback guidance?
So just maybe if so, Lisa, Becky, it sounds like you're aware of it. Alan, Claire, Ross, are you aware of the model? Have you looked at it at all? No problem if you haven't.
Yeah, looked at it, talked about it. It's on the radar.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. We've talked about it in team meetings, and yeah, so we're aware of it.
Yeah, similar.
Okay, and then in the room, aware of it. Yeah. Talia, Trish, maybe not, probably not so much because you're
Never not.
Aware of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm conscious that it's kind of in the freedom of responsibility paper now. It's kind of there, but there's not too much context in the paper with it. So it kind of, that diagram on its own doesn't really tell you anything. So we're just going to go into it a little bit more.
So in the book, she kind of uses this analogy of spinach in your teeth, and I quite like it just because it's one that kind of you could imagine yourself in, and kind of where, guess it's somebody telling you that they have spinach in your teeth, where you can kind of find yourself in these quadrants, I'll just kind of go through the examples, which I've already given you a sneak preview of already. So I think rudeness, empathy is probably where people find themselves more than kind of the other quadrants, because people are kind of, they want to be nice and they don't want to give feedback that might potentially make someone feel uncomfortable or not happy about. So in this scenario, you just don't tell them because you don't want them to feel embarrassed that you're giving them the feedback about spinach in their teeth. But then they continue to walk around all day with it. The other area where you could be is pointing it out in front of everyone in a group of people. You've got spinach in your teeth, and that is obviously not a very nice way to go about it, and the person then kind of feels quite embarrassed about it. At least, with that said, it's not necessarily the absolute worst place to be, because at least they are aware and can avoid that situation going forward. And then this place of manipulative insincerity is kind of like a bit of a difficult one, but I think it's where you find yourself not telling them because you worry how that might make you look, as opposed to how it might make them feel. So you just avoid the situation because you don't really care that much either way. And I think that's kind of the scenario we all want to avoid. And then you pull them aside and tell them quietly kind of the obvious answer, I'd hope, because you do care about the person, you don't want them to feel embarrassed, but you also kind of want to be able to give them that feedback and them not feel embarrassed by it. Does that kind of make sense in terms of that scenario and how you kind of might picture yourself giving someone feedback in that sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's
Yeah,
take,
that makes sense.
if we take another example, this is something that comes up for me quite a lot, because it comes back to one of the previous models actually. So I'm too often late for meetings, and it's something I'm trying to work on because of what that says, what it shows when I'm late for meetings. So it's something I'm working on. But let's say I'm late for a meeting that you're all in. What would the responses be in each of those quadrants? What could some of the things be? What would be, so I'm late, you're disappointed, or you have a reaction to the fact that I'm late for a meeting with you. What would be, what would be in each of them? What would be a ruinously empathetic response, or lack of response to that?
Just not saying anything.
I guess if you were to say, it's fine, it's not a problem at all, nobody minds that you were late.
Yeah.
That even might be going into the manipulative insincerity kind of. It might be between the two there. It's kind of a bit of both. But yeah, absolutely fair.
Yeah, because really you probably don't actually feel that way, and kind of just saying, oh yeah, don't worry, doesn't give Sam the opportunity to like change that behaviour, and kind of you've not really like shown that you care enough to kind of give him that opportunity as well.
I think going back earlier, it's about like the power relationship. Some people might not say it because they might think it's not their place. So it's not because they're embarrassed, it's not because they're worried, it's just because I'm not their manager. It's not for me to point out that they're late to this meeting.
Yeah.
Would that sit anywhere on here? Or is that what we're trying to discourage? We're trying to encourage
that would be
anyone in the room to say, yeah, you're late, this isn't acceptable, but like outside of the room. But some people might just think, I'm not their manager, they're late, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might. It's kind of manipulative insincerity in the sense that it's not. You're not in doing that. You're not caring. So you're not caring personally, and it might be slightly manipulative insincerity in the fact that you're worried about how it might make you look if you say something, or so it might be there.
What might obnoxious aggression look like in that scenario?
Just making a loud comment in front of the room that they're late and it's not okay.
Pretend like you're watching Tutton.
Yeah.
So that again, Tony.
Pretend like you're watching Tutton.
Yeah. So like kind of.
And then another sort of example of where manipulative insincerity might be there. It might be so someone does actually takes the time to tell me that I'm late and the impact that has had on them and others. Maybe on them, what impact it's had on them by me being late. But they might, it might be like surrounded by some praise, so it might be afterwards like, yeah, but you never, it doesn't really matter, I want to tell you you're late because I was, twiddling my thumbs doing and having my time wasted for 10 minutes. But look, don't be too hard on yourself. It's fine. Whereas that might be slightly the manipulative insincerity, because it might be more worried about at the end protecting yourself in that scenario, as opposed to actually being challenging directly and caring about it.
And this is what I was the one that I thought came up first. The line between the two is kind of around the context of the relationship. I think me and Sam were talking about if you knew that, say it was a board meeting in front of all the board members, and you
I also think as well that context is everything. So even I'd have to weigh up with my team or anyone I was working with, because if you know them well, you know, saying to someone you're late again when it's like, yeah, and you know, my partner's sick, I've got 2 children under 5, the dog's died, like, do you know what I mean? I kind of think there's a discussion to be had, but I'm not sure that discussion necessarily needs to be had with kind of you're late again and that's impacted on me. Depending on where that person is sitting at that point, they could just kind of say their response, they're not going to hear that you're caring about them. They're just going to hear you're having a dig at me. I'm trying to juggle X, Y, and Z, and you're kind of on it. I think relationship's important and context is important. If you know your team and you know what's going on, you know, to care personally, you have to know about people. You can't just say, I care personally, so I'm going to kind of question or challenge. Caring personally also amounts to knowing something about that person. I'm not saying you have to know all about their private life, but you can't care about someone if you don't know a context in which they're operating.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's definitely not an opportunity just to say like really outlandish things just because you kind of, you know, I really care about this person. I think they're really, you know, they're really going to benefit from me saying it.
That's just going to tip them over the edge.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's the way, isn't it? The way you approach it. So by not having made up your mind about why someone's late, that's showing that openness, isn't it? So it's not making the judgment, but it might be helpful to the person, even if they had really good reasons why they're late and they're going to continue to be late, to know that it had an impact on someone, that mentioning it gives an opportunity then for that to change in the future, so that they're going to continue to be late for those reasons. If there's a non-judgmental approach to raising it, it then gives that opportunity for a conversation which alerts to the fact that it might happen again, and in those situations the person who had a reaction won't have a reaction again. So I suppose there's an opportunity to care, because I found that sometimes I found myself not giving feedback because the relationship doesn't exist as well as it would need to. But the fastest way to developing the relationship is to have feedback, is to provide feedback and receive feedback. Otherwise, I often might mistake a relationship for being perfectly civil, but actually for meaning something when actually it's quite superficial. And the opportunity that feedback gives, particularly if it's done from a position of openness and care, is to start developing a deeper kind of professional relationship and understanding. So that's I think the opportunity it can give.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Sam, and I'm not suggesting that someone's kind of personal context or whatever context is a preventative factor to giving feedback, but I just think that it's quite crucial to understand that in terms of how you give that feedback. You know, that kind of you're late again. Yep, I am. Do you know, like that for me, that's not a conversation, you know, that I would have with my team with someone who's walked in late. I just don't think it's an appropriate setting for that. But.
Me neither. Where with me with this one, where it's been quite useful is I suppose it was more me. I was conscious of being late too frequently, so I started to then apologise for it, and then I felt like people were, when I was late, some people were saying "don't worry" straight away, very quickly, and then I was intrigued. That was a bit too. I felt like there might be more to it. So a couple of times when I was late for a one-on-one kind of meeting, I asked, "How does it make you feel that when I'm late?" And actually, in exploring it a bit, the person that I did this a couple of times with different people, actually, they felt, it makes me feel like you don't really value me as much as you valued your last meeting. And that might say something a bit about how you see me. My point there is just that it might not be that strong. It might be below the surface, but we're having these feelings, like whether they're affecting us at some level. So exploring them a bit can be quite useful, because now what it means is I'm getting a bit better, and as I'm getting better, if I am late, I will say I'm late because of this. I'm sorry for being late. This is why I'm late. This is why. I appreciate the impact that's had, and that starts to make me more conscious of it, less frequently late, and people having a bit more of an understanding of why.
But I think for me, there's our organisation's quite, how we're structured in terms of a regional model, and then we've got a head office and various different roles. Like, the caring personally is difficult if you've got limited relationships with people that you work with. So, I mean, a lot of the examples that you've given there, Sam, are based around, I would imagine, the people that you see and work with on a daily basis in the London office. However, if you came up to Newcastle and were late for a meeting or, whatever, then, we don't have the relationship. And it's just, I think there's a wider kind of context of how you apply this to, relations with colleagues outside of your immediate team. I think within the regional model of our North East office, I think this is absolutely a model that's very applicable. But I think across the wider organisation, I think it's more difficult, perhaps.
Yeah. I think the relationship obviously is key, and it might not be as easy to apply if you don't know how they might interpret that or receive it. But I think the more that we talk about it and the more that we kind of use it, then it will become easier. For the interest of time, because I can hear the microwave going, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So these are kind of 6 key areas we think when giving feedback, things to consider if they're going to take things away from today. So this first one, try not to be afraid, just is kind of related to sometimes it doesn't necessarily feel that comfortable, but we don't want to be in a position where you're kind of building up a narrative about somebody so that you're kind of in a situation where you've fallen down that relationship model of the feedback. So obviously consider the context of the relationship, but try to kind of push yourself to have those conversations if they need to happen, because that's the next one. But try not to personalise feedback, that saying you're always late versus I've noticed that you've not submitted the last 2 reports on time. They're kind of different things, and you don't want to kind of be picking on things that are actually like personal attributes, because then they kind of, it becomes like more of, I guess it feel more like an attack more than kind of, than trying to actually help that person develop and grow. The better relationship, the easier it gets. So this kind of touches on all the things that we've talked about today. I think Sam and I have come a really long way in terms of giving each other feedback, and now, at first, I didn't really feel that comfortable doing it at all. But the more that we've done it, the more comfortable I feel doing it, and the kind of on the flip side, the more comfortable I've actually been to really genuinely being open to having the feedback from Sam. I think sometimes it's quite hard to kind of really be open to both, and I'll come on to that on the next slide.
Yeah, so on this one, it's it's obvious really, it stands to reason, but it's so true that it's really hard, but being timely with feedback's really important. I mentioned at the beginning, it goes both ways with praise as well. Something I'm struggling with is giving praise in a timely manner, just in the same way. But of course, the things to be careful of in this is that two things. One is kind of if it's driven by emotion, if it's an emotional reaction that you're feeling, it might not be always best to give it immediately or quickly. And then on the other hand, even if you've missed the opportunity and it feels like it's gone, it's normally always good to come back to it. So if it's a month down the line and it's still there, that it's never actually too late to give the feedback. It's not as good, but it's never really too late to be able to provide that. And then the next one is clarity. So being really precise with the language that you use is absolutely crucial. And being clear about the change that would need to be seen, whichever kind of way this is given, whether it's praise or constructive criticism, that what behaviour you want that to result in. Doing more of that, for example, if you've seen something that's really good. And then I always find I'm someone who likes to prepare for stuff, and I find I'm much more effective if I'm well prepared. Probably the same as everybody, but I'm not one of those people that can just. I'm not as strong in the moment, so I sometimes, particularly in getting better at giving and receiving feedback, particularly in giving feedback, being prepared has helped me. Sometimes even being a little bit scripted, I think isn't the end of the world to prepare, but it can be quite helpful. But the problem with scripts is kind of, again, you've made judgments and assumptions, and that's inbuilt in a script. So you get into that thing where you sort of, in your mind, you're kind of like, I'm going to say this, and then they're going to say that, and then I'm then going to say this to that, and then I'm going to. If the problem with that is that it doesn't work like that, and you're already making judgments and assumptions that aren't very helpful as you go along for that. So focusing on kind of preparing around how you might articulate how the impact that it's had on you might be more powerful.
So just kind of touching on what I said earlier about kind of receiving and being open to feedback. It's really, really important to be curious in when you're giving feedback and when you're receiving it, but try not to kind of justify or kind of explain the behaviour away straight away. I think what's really, really key to take away from this is when you're getting feedback, kind of really kind of listen to the reason that you're getting it, and kind of where it's coming from and what you kind of would like to see. But it's still okay to kind of then go back and kind of, as together you're kind of being curious and kind of to understand what could have happened or like what could be done differently. But I think it's really, really good to kind of avoid this kind of justify, like jumping in, well, I've done this because, the cat threw up and I didn't really know what to do, so I was late. It's just kind of like taking it in and kind of taking a step back and just thinking about kind of listening with the intent of actually understanding. And kind of really think about the way that you respond to feedback is ultimately going to impact how people are going to give you feedback again. If you're kind of really not open to it or kind of really defensive, it might, for the person giving the feedback who may not be that confident doing it, it could put them off doing it again. And kind of think about your non-verbal and verbal responses, whether or not you're kind of giving them any eye contact, eye rolls, and kind of be just really aware that the way that you kind of respond to that will have a kind of knock-on impact for both your own development, but also the way that whether or not the person is likely to kind of give you feedback again. And last but not least, just kind of thinking about balancing praise and criticism.
And on this one, it's kind of, there can be a tendency to think that we learn more from our mistakes than our successes. And there can be that moment, I certainly sometimes feel it, where I get some feedback and there's a mixture of criticism and praise, and I'm kind of quick to go to the criticism. But actually, all the stuff on feedback, and you kind of feel this yourself if you really think about it, that actually it's far more important to give praise than criticism in terms of guiding people in the right direction, emphasising what people need to do more of. And I think also there can be a tendency when giving feedback to kind of provide a balance, so particularly around criticism. So the classics are kind of thinking about like putting too much structure on it. So thinking like I want to be giving 3 bits of praise to every bit of criticism, or to, when delivering criticism, sandwiching it around between praise. Those things are, I think, useless and insincere, and you can see through them immediately if you're on the receiving end of that kind of stuff. So I think it's best avoided. And the thing that makes this last point is something I think about a lot, which is if you're really, when you want to deliver some constructive criticism, think about how much time you put into thinking about how to do that appropriately, and making sure you have all the facts in order and that you're being fair. We should be doing exactly the same with praise. We should be being really specific about praise. We should be putting thought into that, how we deliver it, to make sure that it's authentic, that it has an impact. Talking about the impact itself. Although we put a lot of thought into when we're thinking about providing criticism, we should do it absolutely exactly the same for praise.
Can I just say, this slide and the last one, it talks about before criticising somebody, and I just think that language isn't perhaps in keeping with our kind of culture and radical candor. And I think what we're really talking about is before offering constructive feedback. I think, you know, I know what you're trying to say, but I think before criticising someone, that isn't the intention of feedback. The intention is to help them grow and develop and do things differently. So this on this slide and the previous one, I just think it could be misconstrued.
Yeah, it's not. I think criticism is negatively connotated, and that's not what people are intending to do when they're kind of giving developmental feedback. So I'll definitely change that.
Yes.
Going back to the receiving feedback, because it said avoid justifying. For me, that makes it sound like we should just be passive when we're getting feedback. But I do believe quite strongly that we should, when someone gives you feedback, you should be able to express like why that occurred. But it just says avoid justifying. I understand the avoid making excuses, but avoid justifying. I feel like as you've given me feedback, I should be able to explain kind of why I acted that way or why that happened.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It kind of suggests to me that we should just be passive and just be like, okay, yeah, great. I'm going to go back and think about that. Yeah.
No, I think like what I mean by that is let the person kind of like say what they want to say, and then kind of in that bit around being curious, that's kind of like your opportunity to have a discussion around it, but kind of really like listen with the intent of understanding of what the point they're trying to make. I'm not saying that you should just be like, okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's just kind of allowing the person to really kind of express what they're, you know, the reason they're giving to you and the opportunity for you to develop, and then kind of you kind of listening to understand that, and then kind of having a conversation around it.
We are out of time, so I want to respect everybody's time. Thank you so much for joining, everybody on Skype, everybody here. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to join this session. In the interest of feedback, these are a good couple of points at the end. If you've got anything else, send it through to Laura and to me. We really appreciate it. And thanks again for making time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.